Math 1332, Chapter 3, Symbolic Logic, Section 4, Logical Arguments. Video 7, Common Valid Argument Forms, the Law of Disjunctive Syllogism. Cat. This argument form is going to look a little bit different from the three we've seen so far. Let's see if you can figure out why. Can you draw a conclusion from these premises? Premise 1, my name is Dwayne or my name is Steve. Now, clearly my name is neither. It says right here, Chris Chappa. But remember, when you're determining the validity of an argument or a conclusion, you're not questioning the truth of a premise. You're asking if the premises were true, what conclusion could we draw? So anyone can say this argument. Premise 1, my name is Dwayne or my name is Steve. Premise 2, my name is not Steve. Can you draw a conclusion? If you said, well, not that. If you said my name is Dwayne, then you drew a valid conclusion. This argument form is called the law of disjunctive syllogism, and it is a valid argument form. And by the way, all these forms that I'm saying are valid. I'm not just saying because I have a hunch. I'm saying they're valid because if you set up the implication for the argument, that conditional with the two lines, and you built the truth table for it, you would see that the implication is a tautology. So I'm not just saying take my word for it. I could prove it. I just don't want these videos to be any longer than they have to be at this point. Now, I want to focus on the structure of this argument for a moment before we go to the next page. You may have noticed that the first premise is not a conditional. And this is the first common argument form, common valid argument form, where the first premise was not a conditional. So it kind of stands out because the first premise is a disjunction, which is part of the reason why it's called the law of disjunctive syllogism. But let's focus a little bit more on the structure of this. Being a disjunction, the first premise has two simple statements in it, or two statements at least. One of them is my name is Dwayne. One second, folks. Just wasn't working with the cat in my lap. But as I was saying, the first premise being a disjunction has a statement on both sides. The statement on the left is my name is Dwayne, and the statement on the right is my name is Steve. Now, what do you notice about the second premise? It almost matches one of those statements, except it's the negation. And what do you notice about the conclusion? It's one of those statements. And more specifically, it's the statement that we didn't negate in the second premise. Now, this argument form actually comes in two flavors. And to illustrate them, let's just say for a moment that the first premise was the same, my name is Dwayne or my name is Steve, but the second premise was my name is not Dwayne. What conclusion would you draw? My name is Steve. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is it's not always the second statement that has to be negated. Let me go in here and we'll edit that real quick just to illustrate what I mean. If we were to change the second premise, then it would change the coloring a little bit, because now the second premise resembles, the second premise resembles the first statement from the first premise, except it's its negation. And the conclusion matches the other statement. So there's actually two flavors. Your premise says this or that, and your second premise says not one of them, and your conclusion says, oh, then it must be the other. And again, this argument form is called the law of disjunctive syllogism. Symbolically, it looks something like this. Your first premise is a disjunction. Your second premise is the negation of half of that disjunction, and your conclusion is the other half. Just think about it. For an or statement to be true, what's the rule for disjunction? Well, the rule for disjunction is it's false only if all of it's false. So equivalently, that means it's true if at least part of it is true. So the first premise is saying part of this is true, and the second premise is saying it's not this part. So the conclusion is saying, oh, must be the other part that's true. Now, this one does kind of come in two flavors, because it could also look like this. Your first premise is a disjunction, P disjunction Q. Your second premise is, but not the first statement, negation P, and so your conclusion is Q. So it's a little tricky to summarize this one symbolically, because the second premise basically says one of the first two statements is negated, and the conclusion is the other statement that wasn't negated. In fact, the descriptive representation of the law of disjunctive syllogism kind of gets at that, where the first premise is a disjunction of two statements, one statement or another. The second premise is the negation of one of the statements. It doesn't say which one, either the first or the second. And your conclusion is the other statement. So this or that, but not this one. Oh, well, then it must be that one. Let's try to draw a valid conclusion. My dad said to clean my room or do the dishes. I don't want to do the dishes. Now, assuming both of these are true, what can you conclude? Dad said, clean my room or do the dishes. I don't want to do the dishes. Therefore, first premise, second premise, conclusion, I will clean my room. I think this is fairly common sense, because you know, if I say this or that and it's not one, then it's got to be the other. Now, this almost rings of an either or, either do this or that, but it's not quite, because an or can be true if both halves are true. Like if I said, well, let's use the college entrance analogy. You want to go to a college, they say you have to score 1,500 on the SAT or 30 on the SAT. Does that mean you can't do both? Of course you can. In general, the or is the inclusive or, meaning it's okay if both halves are true. This argument form says it's okay if both halves are true, but by the way, this half isn't. Oh, well, then the other one must be true. Let's determine if the following argument is valid. Again, here's a symbolic representation of an argument. It might have been words that got translated already, but if you are trying to choose an argument form to match an argument that's handed to you, I would focus on the core connective on the first statement. In this case, the core connective on the first statement is the disjunction. And right now, we only have one common argument form with a disjunction. There will be a second one. And as a disjunction, if I'm going to use the law of disjunctive syllogism, then I need to look at both halves of it and see if we have the correct structure. So here's the left half of the disjunction, just plain old R. And here's the right half. Let's use a different color. Now, how's the second premise related to the first? Well, it matches the first statement, except it's negated. And notice that the conclusion matches the second half of the disjunction in the first premise. So this argument says this or that, but not this. Oh, well, then it must be that. So in this case, first statement or second statement, but it's not the first. So our conclusion is it must be the second statement. So this is a valid argument, and it is the law of disjunctive syllogism. So don't get too hung up on these guys right here. Don't get too hung up on it's got to look exactly like that, or it's got to look exactly like that. No, structurally, it has to have the same structure. This had the same structure. This or that, but not this one. So it must be that one. And that's the law of disjunctive syllogism. So to summarize it, the law of disjunctive syllogism says the following is a valid argument form. There are two versions of the symbolic. Premise one is P or Q. Premise two is the negation of Q. The conclusion is P. Or premise one is P or Q. Premise 2 is the negation of P. The conclusion is Q. But together they say the same thing. Our first premise is a disjunction of two statements. Our second premise is the negation of one of them. Our conclusion is the other statement.